Good morning. Are there any wrestling fans out there? I'm not talking WWF, I'm talking about college wrestling. No? Yeah, there is a big difference. Because I want to start with wrestling. Imagine in your mind's eye two wrestlers, identical brothers, let's say. Same stature, same reach, same weight, maybe equivalent training and experience. Which one of these brothers will win the match? The older, the one who came out first. Well, I like to think it's the smarter of the two. It's the brother who sees his advantage with superior decision making. The brother who can outwit or outthink his adversary. I think this is really important because we know Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work has told us in a peer-to-peer adversary relationship where militaries may be matched tank for tank, ship for ship, bomb for bomb, we need some other advantage, a strategic advantage, an offset. And so the US Defense Department has been searching for the third offset. And we know that this third offset, the first being nuclear armaments, the second being precision-guided munitions, now the third offset is still just an investment portfolio looking for the breakout technology that will really give our defense force and our allies the strategic advantage. In that portfolio, we know some of the technologies being invested in are cognitive computing or artificial intelligence, systems that reason, learn, and understand the way people understand media and input. Well, why is this the case? It's not just because the speed of computing has given us the opportunity to think about this. I think it's because of this, because we know in peer-to-peer situations, we need to think faster and think better. I'm not the first person, nor is Secretary Bob Work the first to talk about decisive advantage using cognition. After the Korean War, Colonel John Boyd of the US Air Force began talking and writing about something we now commonly refer to as the OODA Loop, which stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, Act. It's essentially a cognitive framework that helped people in the 60s and then later on think about, in air warfare at first, this idea that if you can disrupt your adversary's decision-making process, or you can make your own faster or more effective, then you will have strategic advantage. And today, we think of the OODA Loop as a very common way to refer to decision-making in a military context, and now, indeed, a national security context at the strategic level. I was very troubled late last year when former President Obama told his presidential historian, "The situation in Syria haunts me constantly." He said, "What if there was some move that my staff had not advised me of, that we could have done differently? What if there's something we missed? Something a Churchill or an Eisenhower would have thought of?" Well, President Obama was not seeking specific plans to recapture Europe in 1945. But what he was talking about there was having access to the very best cognition, the very best expert advice and support for decision-making at the national strategic geopolitical level. He felt, the most powerful man on the planet, felt that he lacked in that course of action support. And we can't resurrect people who are gone. It's one of the conundrums of expertise. It's perishable, it disappears. And in fact, on a routine basis, we plan for it. In the military, we roll our best NCOs out of our units every 2 to 3 years. Anyone who's been in the military knows what that feels like when you lose the very best senior chief or master chief from your unit if you're in the Navy, or a senior NCO if you're one of the land forces. How do you capture expertise and scale it? It's extremely difficult. But I would say that's the challenge of our time. And we have an opportunity to scale expertise for the first time in history in a way that's never been done before using cognitive computing and traditional analytics. So what if we could build a course of action advisor that was working for the most disadvantaged, bandwidth limited, challenged end user? Think about a tactical environment where a fire team or a platoon needs course of action advice. If that's a goal for us, to really provide discrete and personalized support to decision makers in the field, how would we actually go about building that? Would it be in the very fabric of their uniforms? There are a lot of ways we could go, but it's a very futuristic vision. That doesn't exist today. But in order to think about how do we get there, we need to understand where we are today with artificial intelligence. So I'll take a quick detour to talk about, very briefly, the difference between two different kinds of artificial intelligence that you can read about in the open press. And they're called narrow artificial intelligence and general artificial intelligence. Some of you have narrow artificial intelligence in your pocket or your handbag right now, or in your home. Does anybody have a Nest thermostat at home? Here we have 2. Is it working? I see 2 yes. Works really well. Probably works better than humans at optimizing the temperature for your home. And it uses machine learning to really understand a pattern and then optimize performance of a very discrete function. It's a function that we used to have humans do, turning the dial or the knob on your thermostat to set the temperature. It's a very simple cognitive task, part of an OODA loop. You sense, you observe that you are feeling uncomfortable in your own home. You orient yourself, oh gosh, maybe my thermostat is not set correctly. You decide to change it, you act. It's very simple, it's overly simplistic. But I mention this to illustrate an example of a very narrow artificial intelligence function that uses machine learning in a home setting to automate a task that was formerly controlled by people manually. It's ubiquitous today. In your handbag or your pocket, you probably have a phone that you speak to from time to time. And it uses multiple narrow artificial intelligence functions to understand your question or command, right? Call my mother, call my wife, or what's my next appointment? But these systems fail when you expect them to perform generally the way a generally intelligent human being would perform in a broad domain environment. So if you turn to your phone and you say, how do I tie my shoes? It's a very personal question, but it's a question any of us would be able to answer. Even most kindergartners could answer. How do I tie my shoes? You know what Siri says? She says, interesting question, which obviously is a default mechanism for when you go off script. So in that case, a very capable narrow artificial intelligence system that has concatenated multiple functions, speech to text, some rank and retrieve of some text in return, has essentially failed when you go off script and try to do something that a generally intelligent person could do, because it's only optimized for frequently asked questions. So while narrow artificial intelligence is ubiquitous, it definitely has its limitations. When I select Jarvis on the right-hand side, Jarvis from the Marvell Comics Iron Man character who developed Jarvis as a personal assistant. And I like this one because it's a very benign general artificially intelligent system. Jarvis is science fiction, and so I illustrate the point here with a science fiction example because today it's a matter of debate in research circles whether or not we'll ever achieve general artificial intelligence or we'll just simply emulate it. Now, I'm a practitioner, not a theoretician. With apologies, I'm not an academic or a PhD. And so I won't worry about this because I need to build systems for you today. And so what do I have on hand? We have narrow artificial intelligence. How do you build complex systems that simulate general artificial intelligence using what you have today? And I think there are some pretty neat examples that will tell us where we're going to go in the future. I think IBM did a great job with the Jeopardy competition in Watson years ago. Now it's going on 6 years ago. But at the time, what captured the fascination of the public and why it merited a televised game show and was considered a grand challenge is that it was a systems engineering and systems integration challenge to take several narrow artificial intelligence functions to integrate them together to emulate the way a generally artificially intelligent system would work, right? So people, it played the game and could answer any question at all and appeared to be thinking. And really what it was doing was understanding text. It had read a big body of knowledge. So what does that mean for today, and how do we get to a future where we can design and build and implement systems that can provide course of action advice for those disadvantaged users in the field? And I want to give you some examples that I think are exciting because they're cross-industry. They don't come from our own defense or national security domain. And so it's with intention I show you where other industries are going and how I think we can co-opt that innovation for our own purposes. First of all, I think I've talked to this point already. The way we're going to do this is by taking and using and exposing many, many of these narrow artificially intelligent functions or cognitive microservices to the world. You can try many of these tonight if you want, or later on today. You can get out your iPad and go try them. On the left, there's a list of the functions that are exposed today, and more are released every month. In this case, the two that are highlighted here on the right-hand side, natural language classifier and retrieve and rank, were two notable ones that were used in the Jeopardy competition and continue to be used in things like conversation services for chatbots. Do you have a question, sir?
So each of these things on the left is an API?
These are all APIs exposed today and available. You can search for Watson APIs and they'll come right to you and you can play with them tonight and build with them. So I think this is really important for the path ahead for building these systems. Okay, so let's talk about some other industry examples and why they point to innovation for defense or national security more broadly. Woodside is an Australian oil and gas company that has gone all in on cognitive computing in a tremendous partnership. It's the 5th largest oil and gas company in Australia, and they have very impressive infrastructure. So when I think about industries that are comparable in some ways to defense organizations or national security organizations that have remote offshore operations, require operations in very stressful conditions in the open ocean at tremendous depths. They have fleets of aircraft. They have fleets of vehicles that make our Mack trucks look like Matchbox cars. So Woodside, their very first investment in cognitive computing was to basically build a lessons learned database, which I know all of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines read thoroughly before they go deployed, right? I think it's a requirement, but let's be honest, it never happens. Well, it wasn't happening for Woodside either. because all of that unstructured text material, all of that written prose that people had written after their operations in oil and gas were going into some database and no one ever read it again. So basically, they asked Watson to read all of their lessons learned. And within the first week of implementation, one of the employees at Woodside said, we're having this problem with bird strikes on our platforms with, I don't know if it was, I think it was helicopters. I wonder if we have any lessons learned. And it turned out the very first answer that came back was an implementation of a technique to avoid airstrikes on oil rigs that was 10 years old in a corpus that had 30 years worth of material. It took 30 seconds to find. Most of that was writing the question. Immediately, Woodside was entranced. Today, they're using it for course of action advice on oil drilling locations. Watson, where do I actually invest to drill to optimize the outcome? Because drilling is an extremely expensive operation, as you might imagine, and costly, high risk for this company. So that's their primary mission, and they're using cognitive computing now, combining all of this sensor data along with things like lessons learned in the past. Just really cool examples that I think are relevant for the military. Also notably, Woodside's implementing predictive analytics to maintain and perform better with the maintenance of their fleet of aircraft and vehicles. Okay, so there's industries we should be looking to. There's a video of a demo outside here that's relevant. It's something IBM's built for the US Stryker for the US Army LOGSA command in a pilot. So I really encourage you to go see it because the same technology that's being used at Woodside that came from essentially commercial industry doing predictive maintenance on washing machines and dishwashers, now being implemented in a defense context for US Stryker vehicles. Course of action advice doesn't only exist in heavy industry. Medical care is an area where I would encourage us all to consider how do we rethink course of action advice for those field commanders? I think there are examples already in medicine today. Watson for Oncology is synthesizing multiple streams of information, historical information, archives of research that human beings, doctors, medical professionals simply cannot keep up with. I had one colleague describe the volume of medical research being essentially the requirement for a doctor to read through a stack of 350 newspapers arrived at his or her door every morning. It's just impossible. So it's one thing to take Watson and say, okay, read all the medical literature. But it's even more important for that literature to be applied in the context of a particular patient's situation, which I would say is a lot like having a commander in the field figure out how does he or she orient themselves to the battlefield? What's the streaming information, the dynamic information in real time coming at me? It's the patient's vital signs, the patient's most recent test records. It's structured data that comes from sensors. And comparing that and that patient's medical history, what is my adversary doing, against all of that research to get the very best advice. And so having a system that's designed specifically for certain kinds of cancers is showing us a pathway. It's not an easy lift and shift out of a medical environment. You don't just drop it into a US Army context. There's a long way to go to get there in application. But there's a roadmap here for us. Personality Insights is very interesting. It's an API that's a little bit different than most of our very discrete narrow artificial intelligence functions. Personality Insights is based on a body of research that says when we speak and when we write, the words we choose say a lot about our personalities. And in fact, researchers have proven that you can interpret those words and match them against a personality test. And we've all taken these Myers-Briggs exams and other kinds of tests through our employers or schools. And they're usually roughly right, according to a psychologist's baseline assessment. So this technology IBM invested in for marketing. So it might surprise you to realize that, and maybe it doesn't surprise you now, but there's this field in marketing called hyper-personalized marketing that targets ads to you. And in this case, this example is selected with intention because we know that marketers really want to market to expecting or new mothers because it's an inflection point in the life where product choice and selection changes significantly. And so marketers really want to target ads to this very, very specific part of the marketplace. So what does this have to do with defense and national security? Probably questioning. Personality insights, we now have, through another pilot with the US government, proven that US government psychologists would agree with the personality insights assessment provided by this tool in less than 5 seconds with 3,000 characters of words. University of California at San Francisco took this technology and said, we could probably figure out what the baseline personality is for a veteran and then compare that over time to observe whether they're stressed or not. And those results came back positive. And now a company called Teatros, a partner with IBM, has rolled out a new application that's supporting veterans for PTSD treatment. So how does it work? It's really cool, actually, and it's tackling a huge problem. There are 3 million veterans from Afghanistan and Iraq combined. 1 in 5 of those, evidently, according to the research, is showing signs of PTSD. Less than 10% of those who are diagnosed complete their treatment within the first year of diagnosis. So this application is really designed to help people complete their treatment. It doesn't treat them. It doesn't intervene. But what it does is it understands the baseline of where a person is starting, personality-wise, interacts with them, collects information. This is all collaborative and cooperative with the patients, and then allows their treatment advisors to detect when there's something anomalous in their behavior and reach out to them and intervene. So it's people intervening, people in the loop, but it's using and leveraging Personality Insights API as well as other APIs like speech to text, for example. So the results so far are very encouraging. Of the veterans who are using this particular application, compared to the less than 10% that complete their treatment, 73% have completed treatment when they use this application. It continues to engage them in a way that clinical work just simply doesn't do. So you're probably now wondering, why am I showing you a fancy dress? Last year, there was an event called the Met Gala, which the theme was, it's basically a fashion show or design show. And the idea is to show the intersection of fashion and technology for last year's. So IBM teamed with a design house called Marquesa, which is really known for very romantic styles, sort of an unlikely partnership. But what they created was a dress that listens socially. So you see the flowers on the dress are lighted, and the lights respond in real time to the social media reaction to the dress. So if you can imagine this model walking down the red carpet into the event, and people are watching her and responding to what she's wearing and who she is and how she's behaving, all of that is being listened to, and the dress is changing colors in response to the tone and the sentiment of the reaction. So the dress is listening and responding. Well, I ask you, back to our challenge of trying to build systems that can support warfighters in the field. What about a soldier who has a uniform that listens? We could build that today. Or we may not need that, or maybe we do. Provincial reconstruction teams in Afghanistan struggled. In some urban settings, not all of them were urban, not everyone was able to, was in a population where people are using cell phones, but in environments where people are using cell phones and social media, this might be very handy to provide our most tactical forces with an ability to understand how the population is responding to them in real time. So I finish today with thank you for listening. Back with our challenge. Building course of action advice for the most tactical, the most bandwidth limited, the most disadvantaged user is not here today. But I'm confident we can build it. We need system engineering. We need to break the system down into its components. We need to really understand ourselves. We need to understand what is that OODA loop we're trying to facilitate and automate. What are the decisions that he or she has to make? And what parts of that process can we break down into very fine, small subcomponents and automate or facilitate and support? And then we should begin to build it. Thank you for listening, and it's my time. We have time for Q&A. Any questions? Hi there.
So I'm just kind of curious. You're up against a cultural challenge here as well, right? Especially with the military, where they have such a long history of doing things the same way for decades, and they've relied on it, right? It saved their lives in a lot of cases. So you build this. How do you convince them to take that step and to use it?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I've seen over the past 5-6 years working with this technology is that you're absolutely right. Sometimes the cultural change is more difficult than building the technology. But I think people are going to be people forever, and they're never going to change the way they begin to trust another person or system. And so I think the way we build trust is to have systems do what people do to build trust, to show the evidence of where they came up with their answers, to provide the provenance and lineage, for example, of information when they recommend a course of action so that the human can really check and make sure it's valid. Now, in a real-time situation, that's not easy to do, but I think this takes time, this kind of cultural transformation and a reliance on systems. We need to implement them in small pieces, small chunks. So much the way people would introduce themselves and say, okay, here, I'm from, I have this background, these are the schools I went to, or bios are sent forward, and it all kind of has the same sort of information. Here's where I worked, here's the kind of technology I understand. Those are ways in shorthand that people communicate with one another in a professional environment and kind of get very quickly, okay, I kind of get where this person's coming from, and then they decide for themselves whether to trust it. Again, similarly, as we move forward with cognitive computing in particular, we have to do much the same thing. We're going to probably become more and more familiar with subcomponents or modules of cognitive computing that we're going to begin to trust better and better. I'll give you an example. So visual recognition, the ability for systems to monitor static images or video and recognize and detect objects, characterize them, maybe for threat purposes, threat prediction purposes, or other applications. These are things that 10 years ago people wouldn't have necessarily trusted, they wouldn't have been reliable enough. But you can create the machine learning models, you can measure the accuracy, and you can surface that to people in a testing and validation phase before you actually roll these things out. And then you can begin to trust just that one component of the technology. And that would be embedded in a much more elaborate system, and that may be a traditional analytic system that doesn't have machine learning. People won't realize that it's got AI in it, but it does. I mean, that's really what's happening today, and the way we're becoming more comfortable with our AI being in our cell phones and in our homes. It's just in these very narrow functions.
So not as much of a question as an observation. I'm the director of weather for the Air Force. Obviously, data analytics in the weather forecasting business is pretty important. And certainly over the last 20 years, we've really embraced that, and we've automated a great number of things. The negative aspects of that, which a lot of us perhaps aren't considering, in the military and the uniform ranks in particular, we leverage kids coming out of high school. We provide them advanced technical training, and we bring them up to speed. And traditionally, what we found is that as they come out of school and then come into active duty and they start doing their job, their skill set continues to improve considerably. Now that we've implemented many of these automated techniques, a lot of the APIs and so forth, we're discovering that they're coming out of school with this skill set, and the longer they spend time working with computers, their skill set starts to go down. They've become so dependent on it, and they use it as a crutch. It's become an issue where we need to change our TTPs, tactics, and so forth, and that's a challenge in how to change that whole training problem. And then the second aspect, here in the United States, when you're doing business, in weather in particular, we have a tremendous amount of data, and you can rely upon APIs and automation. But then as you go forward into the battle space, you're in Iraq, Afghanistan, or wherever, or Central Africa, where that same data scheme isn't available. And now I've got a human being that relies on computers that lacks the skills to do the job because the API isn't working. So we need help from industry to help us make that transition. Because ultimately, if I build a soldier that is so dependent on the computer, if the computer's not there or the data's not there, how am I supposed to do my warfighting job?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good point. As you said, it's not really so much a question as a statement. I can't disagree with you. Any other questions, comments?
Can you a little bit talk about the privacy in these systems when it's applied to military?
Sure.
Thank you.
Privacy is extremely important, of course. As industry, we're going to build to the standards required and dictated to us by our government clients, and we have to adhere to that. I do often observe that sometimes when we introduce technologies, we can challenge the existing policy, right? And there are things the technology can accomplish that the policy won't permit, like commingling data in one repository that maybe our regulations, policy, or law would not permit, like law enforcement and intelligence content, for example, not being commingled. There's technologies that would allow one to commingle the data, but prevent it from being spilled over into or presented to the wrong user. For privacy, it's very similar. For healthcare information, when I talk about the PTSD application, for example, that particular example protects privacy because it's designed for a person who has co-opted or decided to collaborate and use that application, and they've offered up their information. One of the things that we note is that there's this concern about monitoring people and their behavior without 100% compliance or cooperation by the observed population. And in the defense environment, of course, we, having been in the military myself, retired officer, I recall we knew that our communications were subject to monitoring. But even still, in many organizations, depending on which U.S. agency you're talking to, the implementation of that standard can vary from place to place. So again, as industry, we have to just adhere to what those lawyers at that particular agency are telling us to do. Data aggregation often gives us an opportunity to help those agencies figure out how to monitor a population without breaching privacy. So what do I mean by that? You can monitor an entire population understand what baseline and normal looks like, compare individuals against that baseline without having a human actually know the identity of that individual who's broken that threshold. And then people with the privileges or the authority to look at that individual's personal information, you can decide whether or not it merits having that person look at the data if it breaches a threshold that's been established by people, right? And you set the controls in place. We strongly recommend in a lot of cases that you look at aggregating content first so that you're watching populations at large and and it's anonymized. That was my last question. Thank you so much for listening. Enjoy the rest of your day.